Chapter 280 Holy Fire Priestess 3. Embroidered Uniform Guard Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikizo looked at someone with a slightly tense expression. In front of him stood a middle-aged man with a strong impression and only a mustache, paying his respects. Although he was clearly in a higher position, the pressure he exuded as one of the top 5 masters in the Imperial Palace was no ordinary matter. He was none other than Hyun Soon, the Northern Pacification Commissioner, one of the 2 pacification commissioners who could be considered the pinnacle among the Embroidered Uniform Guard's field officers. He seems to be getting stronger. Sang Ikizo had watched his growth since he joined the Embroidered Uniform Guards. He had already surpassed him in strength long ago, but now he was incomparable. It wasn't for nothing that he had become one of the top masters in the Imperial Palace. Murmur. The area behind Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon was chaotic. A crowd of people wearing embroidered uniform guard attire kept gathering, including lesser banners of junior 7th rank, chief banners of senior 7th rank, probationary 100 men commanders of junior 6th rank, 100 men commanders of senior 6th rank, deputy 1,000 men commanders of junior 5th rank, 1,000 men commanders of senior 5th rank, 6 offices commanders of junior 4th rank, and pacification commissioners of senior 4th rank. The reason they had gathered here was singular. It was an emergency summons. From the Associate Military Commissioner and above, they gained the authority to mobilize the Embroidered Uniform Guards in an emergency summons. Here, mobilization didn't mean the complete entirety of the force. Even if it was called mobilization, it excluded the Southern Pacification Commissioner who closely guarded His Majesty the Emperor, the first office that guarded the inner palace and the imperial family, and the 4th office that was in charge of the prisons. However, these 6th office bastards. Most of the Embroidered Uniform Guards had gathered, but only those from the Deputy 1,000 Men Commander and below had come from the 6th office. The 6 offices commander of the 6th office, So Yaren, and the 1,000 Men Commander Ma Arihayan did not come. Crunch. Now that this guy has escaped from the poison, is he refusing the emergency summons? No, wait. Is he planning to stab me in the back along with 6 offices commander So Yaren? If that was the case, it would become very troublesome. Although he had escaped the poison thanks to Defender-in-Chief Mook Siam, who was from the same organization as the deceased Embroidered Uniform Guard 100 Men Commander Jiam Chong, he still had the weakness of the human skin mask. If an investigation were to be conducted with that, his position would be in jeopardy. Damn it. So he informed Defender-in-Chief Mook Siam about being caught with this weakness. Then Defender-in-Chief Mook Siam said, "I will take care of the human skin mask. So, Associate Military Commissioner, pretend to be the Chief Eunuch Ho of the Western Depot and catch that person." Catch that person, you say? But even Jiam Chong was no match for him, so how? I'm not telling you to catch him alone. Don't tell me. Issue an emergency summons for the Embroidered Uniform Guards. If we can deploy at least half of the Embroidered Uniform Guards forces, we can catch him without difficulty. That may be true, but we have sufficient justification. Since there is suspicion that the person close to Prince Jiayong is an impostor, no one will question or object to the emergency summons. For this reason, Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikizo had issued the emergency summons. However, now that the masked 1,000 Men Commander Ma Arihayan, who held his weakness, did not come, he hesitated on what to do. It had to be one of 2 things. Either they had read his moves and were trying to backstab him, or Defender-in-Chief Mook Siam was in the process of taking away his weakness from them, as he had boldly claimed. If that was the case, we must hurry. In any case, both they and he had no choice but to make diversionary moves. Trusting Defender-in-Chief Mook Siam and catching that fake Chief Eunuch Ho was the only way to resolve everything. Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikizo looked at the gathered Embroidered Uniform Guards. Nearly 60% of those in the Imperial Palace had gathered. In terms of military strength, this was sufficient. If they pressured that person with Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon at the forefront, they could sufficiently subdue him, no kill him. Thud. Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikizo raised his hand and spoke in a loud voice. It seems we don't have the luxury to wait for the leaders of the 6th offices. From now on, we will go to Prince Jiayong's icy palace to save His Highness. Like that, The embroidered uniform guard forces led by Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikasio were heading towards Prince Jaiyong's palace. Originally, it was forbidden for a military group exceeding the designated number to enter the palace of the imperial family, but if it served the purpose of rescuing the imperial family, it was exceptionally allowed. That was also why Defender-in-Chief Muxium had proposed this. Before long they had almost reached the vicinity of Icy Palace. They just needed to pass the palace hall. We must kill him without fail. There was no need for subduing him. Since they couldn't let him speak as it would be dangerous, he had to issue an order to execute him. Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikasio was about to give the order. But right at that moment, rumble rumble rumble. What? The ground. The ground shook and an earthquake occurred. Startled by this, the embroidered uniform guard forces stopped moving towards Icy Palace. The sudden earthquake occurred throughout the entire imperial palace, causing roof tiles to fall, and it was utter chaos everywhere. What the hell is this? It was already frustrating that they had to hurry, but the earthquake made it even more difficult. While wondering what was going on, red smoke was seen rising from somewhere. The red smoke made the embroidered uniform guards more agitated than the earthquake. That was because the red smoke signified that a major incident had occurred in the underground prison, and it was a red signal requesting assistance accordingly. With this, the 6 offices' commanders approached and said, "Elder Associate Commissioner, what should we do about this? Shouldn't we also send forces to the underground prison by dividing the personnel?" That's right. The red signal means there was an escape attempt in the underground prison. At the opinions of these 6 offices' commanders, Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikithyo's stomach churned. "No, this is driving me crazy. The goal is right in front of us. To catch that guy he needed all the current forces. With only half, it was extremely unsettling. However, he couldn't ignore the red signal from the underground prison either. Just as he was agonizing over what to do, Elder Associate Military Commissioner, Pacification Commissioner, look over there." At that moment, a 1,000-man commander from the 3rd office raised his hand and pointed towards Icy Palace. Wondering what was going on, he turned his head and saw Prince Jaiyong standing on the roof of Icy Palace. "It's His Highness Prince Jaiyong. Why is His Highness on the roof?" The embroidered uniform guards couldn't hide their perplexity at Prince Jaiyong's sudden action. Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikasio was no exception. His head was already messed up, and now that Prince Jaiyong was on the roof in a precarious state, it felt like his head was about to explode. "We must save His Highness." At that moment, Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon tried to step forward. They were right in front of the Icy Palace Hall, so they couldn't ignore the danger to the imperial family member. However, just as Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon was about to take a step forward, the embroidered uniform guards are driving this king to his death. Swish. Prince Jaiyong suddenly shouted those words and jumped off the roof. "Oh no!" Thud. In an instant, Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon used his lightness skill to the fullest to catch him somehow. However, no matter how skilled he was and how outstanding his lightness skill was, there was a distance to catch him. Thud. He missed him by just 5 steps. Prince Jaiyong, who had fallen headfirst, had his neck twisted grotesquely and collapsed. Blood flowed from Prince Jaiyong's twisted body, dyeing the surrounding ground red. Shocked by the sudden action followed by a sudden the worst situation, Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon and the embroidered uniform guards were at a loss for words. The one who was most speechless among them was Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ikasio of the embroidered uniform guards. Damn it. He had come to catch the fake supervisor of the Western Depot, but the situation had spiraled out of control. The justification for issuing the emergency summons was to save Prince Jaiyong, a member of the imperial family. But he had died. Moreover, as he jumped, he said that the embroidered uniform guards had driven him to his death. Sangiko sat down on the ground as if he had fallen into despair. Flinch. Swish. At that moment, Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon, who had been examining the body of the deceased Prince Jaiyong, half drew the sword from the scabbard at his waist and looked around. Northern Pacification Commissioner Hyun Soon, surveying the surroundings like that, couldn't understand. Just a moment ago he had felt something eerie from Prince Jaiyong. But it had disappeared in an instant. What was that just now? There was a spirit body in the air watching him who was puzzled like this. She was none other than Chong Ryung, clicking her tongue while holding a long pipe. Not bad. After absorbing the demonic energy of the golden nine-tailed fox, one of the 6 demons kings, her spiritual energy had become almost indigo-level sprit. So even if it was someone who had surpassed the limits, she thought they wouldn't easily detect her spiritual energy, but he noticed it in an instant. If her spiritual energy hadn't evolved further, she might have been discovered. Chong Ryong flew upward. I did as that mortal brat told me to, but I wonder if this alone will be enough to divert attention. Around the same time, in one of the Imperial Palace's food storage warehouses, about 50 jang away from the entrance to the underground prison. This place, which stored dried seafood and such, had a particularly strong smell, so it had unusually low traffic unless one came to get food ingredients. Rumble, 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 rumble. Due to the earthquake shaking the entire warehouse, someone got up from their spot and slightly opened the warehouse door. Creak. And through the gap they couldn't hide their astonishment at the red smoke they saw. That was the red signal indicating that a major incident had occurred in the underground prison. When that smoke signal appeared, regardless of the reason, all the embroidered uniform guards except for the first office had to be dispatched, just like in an emergency summons. Thud. Someone hurriedly closed the warehouse door. He was none other than the masked 1,000-men commander Ma Arehayan. Ma Arehayan was dumbfounded. Didn't they say they would quietly help them escape? The situation had become extremely complicated. If the red signal had been raised, it was as good as confirming the fact that there was an escape from the underground prison. Ma Arehayan walked to one side of the warehouse, frowning deeply at the seriousness of the situation. It was no exaggeration to say that escape had become nearly impossible. How the hell are they going to come here? He had urgently searched and found a safe base for the escape because he was told to prepare one. But it seemed that everything was about to be ruined. The situation had become difficult. In this case, should he go to the underground prison for now in response to the red signal? Just as he was contemplating what to do. Thud. At that moment, without sensing any presence, the warehouse door suddenly opened. The startled 1,000-men commander Ma Arehayan hurriedly hid his body between the stacked wooden crates in the warehouse. Then the opened warehouse door closed again. Who is it? Ma Arehayan suppressed his presence to the maximum. Judging from the fact that he couldn't feel the presence of the person who entered, they were clearly a tremendous master. But then he heard a sound as if something was being dragged. Ha! Ha! The breathing was uneven. It was the breathing of someone who had been injured. At that moment a voice was heard. 1,000-men commander Ma Arehayan. At that voice, Ma Arehayan couldn't hide his inner perplexity. The owner of the voice was none other than his master, no, his superior, the leader of the 6th office, 6 offices commander So Yaren. Ma Arehayan's eyes slightly trembled. Why did she come to this place where he was? While he was puzzled, 6 offices commander So Yaren said, "What the hell were you doing to be tracked by someone like this?" Tracked. What does that mean? Wondering about it, he had no choice but to come out from between the dried seafood crates. In front of So Yaren, who had her arms crossed, a person who seemed to be injured with bruises on his face, was lying face down. Judging by his attire, he was a low-ranking eunuch of the Eastern Depot. Was she saying that person had secretly followed him? If he could hide his presence to that extent, he had to be either a trained person or a Master 1 level above him. However, based on his breathing and energy, he wasn't a Master 1 level above him. At that moment, 6 offices commander So Yaren, who had her arms crossed, spoke. 1,000-men commander Ma. What the hell are you doing? An emergency summons was issued by the Associate Military Commissioner of the Embroidered Uniform Guards. So I went to get you and accidentally discovered this person following you. What are you hiding from me? At her words filled with suspicion, Ma Arehayan was at a loss. The reason he had come here was to help a prisoner from the underground prison escape. Therefore he couldn't reveal this fact. Tap tap tap. 6 offices commander So Yaren approached him with a cold expression. Although she trusted Ma Arehayan, who was her deputy and almost like her disciple, taking such secretive actions without informing her of anything was an act of betraying that trust. Feeling the disappointment from her, Ma Arehayan hesitated on what to do. If you don't tell the truth. Before she could finish her sentence. Swish swish swish. At that moment, the space right next to them rippled and suddenly, smoke rose, creating a round entrance. At the sudden bizarre phenomenon, the heads of 6 offices Commander So Yaren and 1,000-men Commander Ma Arihayan simultaneously turned towards it. The eyes of the 2 people who turned widened. What the hell was this? Why did such an entrance suddenly appear in the warehouse? As 6 offices Commander So Yaren was puzzled by this incomprehensible phenomenon, her expression hardened. It was because of the people she saw beyond the entrance. Prisoners. Although she had never been assigned to the 4th office and had never entered the underground prison, as an embroidered uniform guard, she was familiar with the prisoners' attire. 2 of them were wearing prisoners' uniforms and the one unconscious over there was Zhu Wenxiang. Trini Zhu Wenxiang. And the one holding something strange between his index and middle fingers at the entrance was Trainee On Zhonghu. Seeing these 2 she could instinctively be certain. Although it was hard to believe, this mysterious entrance made of smoke seemed to be connected to the Imperial Palace's underground prison. Because she knew that both of them had entered as apprentices of the 4th office, which was in charge of the prison this time. At that moment, Trainee On Zhonghu, who was standing in front of the entrance, alternately looked at Ma Arihayan and So Yaren and spoke. Did 1,000-men Commander Ma bring that person? The moment he heard the transmitted sound ringing in his ears, Ma Arihayan realized that Trainee On Zhonghu was Mok Jiangun. Because of this, Ma Arihayan's mind became complicated for a moment. Not only did he change his face again, but was this what he meant when he said he could escape from the underground prison? Right then. Swish. 6 offices Commander So Yaren drew her sword from the scabbard at her waist, aimed it at Mok Jiangun, who had the face of Trainee On Zhonghu, and said, "What the hell are you doing right now?" At her words, Mok Jiangun looked at Ma Arihayan's reaction and let out a soft sigh. Judging by his vigilant appearance, it seemed he hadn't intentionally brought her. Having this woman involved was somewhat annoying, but there was no choice. They had to cross the entrance first. This treasure he was holding between his fingers was something he had received from Yeo Surin, the disciple of Scarlet-Tailed Old Immortal, the master of Harmonious Immortal Pavilion, one of the 2 most mysterious pavilions among the 64 pavilions of diviners. This treasure, which he had won in a bet, was a useful item that created a door to a desired location within a radius of about 200 jang, but only once. However, while it was very useful, it was a one-time use. So they had to quickly cross to the other side before it closed. Swish, swish, swish. Seeing the entrance gradually becoming unstable, it seemed they had to hurry. With this, Mok Jiangun pulled out the demonic sword Plundering Killing Sword, which was stuck in front of the entrance, and gestured towards the Holy Fire Priestess and the 9 blood cult's 6th blood Saint Dam Bekha behind him, saying, "For now, let's hurry and cross before the door closes." Of course, he altered his voice. 6 offices Commander So Yaren thought he had died after being ambushed while injured at the medicine house. There was no point in letting her know he was alive. However, whoosh 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 whoosh. At that moment, the demonic energy of the Plundering Killing Sword surged, trying to erode Mok Jiangun. Mok Jiangun's eyebrows raised at the demonic energy, which was much stronger than expected. To this extent, it was far more severe than the evil commandment sword. Because of this, Mok Jiangun had no choice but to draw upon his demonic energy to avoid being eroded by the sword's demonic energy and suppress it. However, the moment he drew upon his demonic energy, clang! A sword flew at him like lightning, and Mok Jiangun hurriedly pulled out the Plundering Killing Sword to block it. The one who had swung the sword was none other than 6 offices Commander So Yaren. So Yaren spoke with a stiffened face. "You were alive." Her energy perception was very sensitive, so she accurately remembered the energy she had experienced before. For her, revealing a unique energy like demonic energy was no different from revealing his own identity. At her words, Mok Jiangun scratched his head as if he was in a predicament. "Ah, I unintentionally got caught. How did you? More importantly, I don't have time, so I think you should step aside." Boom. With those words, Mok Jiangun infused demonic energy into the Plundering Killing Sword, creating a repulsive force, and flung 6 offices Commander So Yaren away along with her sword. Swish 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 swish. Pushed back about 6 steps by the sudden strong repulsive force, her eyes wavered. This guy. His martial power has increased. It wasn't just a matter of increasing. It had been enhanced to an incomparable extent compared to when she had fought him. Not only was the person she thought had died actually alive, but what the hell had happened in just a few days? Chapter 281, Entanglements 1. Keep in mind the duration you can maintain the door depends on your curse power, but as this is a one-time talisman, it won't last very long. These were the words of Yeo Su-rin, a diviner from Harmonious Immortal Pavilion. Although Mok Jaeongun's curse power had reached a level incomparable to before, there was a limit to how long he could maintain the door with a single-use talisman. Whoa. Mok Jaeongun slightly furrowed his brows at the intense demonic cry and looked at the plundering killing sword. It was said to be the worst demonic sword, and those words didn't seem to be an exaggeration. It's quite rebellious. As he tried to suppress the demonic cry that was attempting to erode him with its evil energy, it spewed out an even stronger cry, as if provoking a battle of strength. It made sense now how Ju Wunhyang, who possessed innate true energy, had been corrupted. At this, Mok Jaeongun drew out even more evil energy. Only by completely subduing the swords could he make it submit to him like the evil commandment sword. Go. As black haze rose, Mok Jaeongun gestured with his other hand. Please come this way. At his words, 9 blood sects 6th blood Saint Dam Bekha and Holy Fire Priestess nodded and were about to move. However, So Yeren, who had been pushed back by Mok Jaeongun's counterforce, drew up her energy and shouted, I don't know how you're alive or learned such bizarre techniques, but I can't let you take the prisoners from the underground golden prison. Pot. No sooner had she finished speaking than she flew towards Mok Jaeongun. How annoying. As Mok Jaeongun had to maintain the door with his curse power, he couldn't move properly and had to confront So Yeren's sword head-on as she rushed at him. Clang clang clang. In an instant their swords clashed about 4 times. Rather than using sword energy, So Yeren had aimed at Mok Jaeongun with concise sword techniques and her eyes flashed. It wasn't a mistake after all. How did his martial power increase this much? Mok Jaeongun's martial power was not much inferior even compared to her own. Moreover, he originally had sword talent, so as his power increased he easily blocked her sword. Thanks to that, he had become much more difficult to deal with than before. I can't subdue him with simple techniques. Then I have no choice but to use sword energy. At this, So Yeren properly gripped her sword and unleashed a technique. Her sword created a trajectory with a fierce momentum, like a tiger pouncing. First stance, Tiger Fang sword stance. Clang 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 clang. In response to her sword energy, Mok Jaeongun also tried to counter with a complex sword technique. He had recently created 2 new sword stances for the demonic sword art and wanted to test them out anyway. But just as he was about to unfurl the second stance of the demonic sword art, woo! At that moment, the demonic energy of the plundering killing sword that he had been suppressing with evil energy explosively soared. It was like immense resentment or anger. Feeling this will of the plundering killing sword, Mok Jaeongun couldn't hide his bewilderment. For some reason, the moment 6 Offices Commander So Yeren began to unleash her sword energy in earnest, the sword's demonic will became uncontrollable. He didn't know the reason, but the demonic energy surged so much that Mok Jaeongun, thinking that forcibly suppressing it might damage the sword itself, decided, all right. Do as you wish. He chose to indulge the plundering killing sword's will once. The moment Mok Jaeongun loosened his grip on the sword, swish. The tip of the sword moved on its own, creating a sword path. As that sword path formed, something flashed through Mok Jaeongun's mind. It seemed to be a vision that the plundering killing sword was showing him through its will. In the vision, the plundering killing sword was being held by someone facing off against a young man. However, the sword techniques the young man unleashed were very similar to those used by 6 Offices Commander So Yeren. Did they clash before? Seems so. The man confronting the plundering killing sword in the vision displayed truly remarkable swordsmanship, overwhelmingly pushing back his companion, whether it was the plundering killing sword's owner or host. Here the plundering killing sword exuded immense demonic energy. It was clear anger. Look at this. The corners of Mok Jaeongun's mouth twitched. He had thought that no matter how much demonic energy it possessed, it was just a sword. But this was the first time he felt a sword's will expressing anger towards something it had clashed with. Wung. At that moment, the sword path created by the plundering killing sword generated wave-like ripples. Along with it, 6 Offices Commander So Yeren, who had been using the Tiger Fang sword stance, felt the excess in her technique rebound. Bong. She was pushed back once again. So Yeren regained her posture and spoke with sharp eyes fixed on Mok Jaeongun's sword. A technique of the scripture of transferring true chi. That sword is plundering killing sword. You recognize the sword. Of course. Among the swords crafted by the famed swordsmith Oyezi, that is the most evil and dangerous one. You'd best let go of it at once. At her warning, Mok Jaeongun shrugged. Well, is there a reason to let go of a sword that's already in my hands? That sword's demonic energy is incomparable to Oyezi's other swords. You could lose yourself. I'll find out when I experience it. You really do as you please. Contrary to her words, So Yeren was inwardly perplexed. With the exception of one person, she remembered that everyone who grasped that sword was unfailingly corrupted by the demonic energy and went mad. However, Mok Jaeongun's current state still seemed sound. Was that somber and vicious energy preventing him from being eroded by the demonic will? Whatever the case, if he hadn't been corrupted yet, she had to make him release the sword. With this thought, she drew upon more of her innate true energy, intending to properly demonstrate her skill. But then, you called us out, yet how long are you going to be like that? 9 Blood Sect's 6th Blood Saint Dam Bekha, who had approached behind Mok Jaeongun, asked in an irritated tone. At this, Mok Jaeongun replied without turning his head. You'll be able to come out soon. And I'd appreciate it if you could also take care of your fallen friend over there. You mean this brat? That fallen friend was none other than Ju Wunhyang. As 6th Blood Saint Dam Bekha tried to approach the collapsed Ju Wunhyang, 6 Office's commander So Yeren hurriedly shouted, "Don't touch him." At her cry, Dam Bekha's lips curved into a smirk. Dam Bekha placed her sharp nails against Ju Wunhyang's neck and said, "Seems like you have some relationship with this young lad. If so, you'd best step aside at once." You. Perhaps enraged by the threat, 6 Office's commander So Yeren threw something towards Dam Bekha, who was behind Mok Jaeongun with lightning-fast hand movements. Clang. Mok Jaeongun hurriedly blocked it with the plundering killing sword. Clink. The object So Yeren threw was sliced in half and fell to the ground. Thud. Thud. This is. It was none other than iron beads. But the problem was it wasn't just one. Clang. 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 While Mok Jaeongun was cutting them, 3 iron beads flew in simultaneously. With his excellent vision, Mok Jaeongun twisted the sword's path to hastily cut one flying iron bead and struck another with his left fist. Bang! However, he couldn't block the remaining one as it flew in an unexpected trajectory. Swish! Huh! It had bounced off the ground and flown towards Dam Bekha's forehead in a bizarre path. However, Dam Bekha was no ordinary expert either. She caught the flying iron bead with her red-stained hand in a swift motion. Catching the iron bead, 6th Blood Saint Dam Bekha muttered with narrowed eyes. Flicking divine skill? Flicking divine skill. It was a technique of imbuing objects with martial power and flicking them with fingers. When martial power was imbued into an object, it became like a hidden weapon. With the hardness of iron beads, it could generate enough force to penetrate a person in a single strike. However, those who wielded flicking divine skill with iron beads like this were extremely rare even in the martial world. Dam Bekha instinctively thought of someone. But then, Blood Jade hands. The 6 Office's commander So Yeren, who had launched the flicking divine skill at her, shouted in surprise. Recognizing Dam Bekha's Blood Jade hands, a gleam flashed in So Yeren's eyes, who seemed to be a high-ranking woman in the embroidered uniform guard. You recognize the Blood Jade hands, young lass. You have good insight. Are you the blood demon of the Blood Sect? At So Yeren's question, Dam Bekha gnashed her teeth and said, "That's right. I am the blood demon of the Blood Sect who was imprisoned in the eternal hell prison for so many years by you lot." Perhaps her fury surged as Dam Bekha drew out even more martial power. Then her hands turned an even deeper shade of red and a smooth luster flowed out. "Step aside. I'll deal with that embroidered uniform guard wench myself." Pot. Dam Bekha flew forward and shouted at Mok Jaeongun to move aside. Mok Jaeongun, thinking this was perfect, stepped to the side. While she dealt with the troublesome 6 Office's commander So Yeren, he could get Holy Fire Priestess out. Pot. 6th Blood Saint Dam Bekha, passing through the smoke door, unleashed hand techniques towards 6 Office's commander So Yeren. Bloodjade Hand's sixth stance, Bloodjade Shatter. Her two hands dyed crimson, unfurled villainous hand techniques and rushed at So Yaren with the momentum to tear her body apart in an instant. It was precisely that moment. So Yaren's sword grip changed and her momentum shifted. It was different from the sword techniques she had displayed so far. For a fleeting instant, her sword emitted a vermilion aura and unleashed tremendous killing energy, as if specialized solely in taking lives. Clang 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 clang. The stance of the Bloodjade hands and her vermilion sword energy collided, producing a tremendous shattering sound. It was a tremendous momentum as if they would finish each other off. However, that didn't happen. Halfway through their stances, as if they had conferred with each other, the two women simultaneously withdrew their energy and retreated at the same time. Bam! Putting distance between them, the two spoke simultaneously. As expected, you are the blood demon. Eh? Is it really you of Jin Clan? The eyes of the two women who had spoken to each other like that reddened at the same time. Their reactions were as if they had been searching for each other for a long time. Watching this with bewilderment, Mok Jung-un still had to get Holy Fire Priestess to escape, so he gestured to her, who had been unable to do anything due to the fierce battle. Come. Will it be all right? Yes. With that, Holy Fire Priestess laboriously led her aged body and arduously tried to walk towards the door. Mok Jun also shouldered Ju Wunhyang, who had been lying in front of the smoke door. The smoke was gradually dissipating. There was truly no time now. Right then. Officer So. Someone's shout was heard from afar. A person appeared, unleashing lightness skill while gasping for breath as if being chased by something, through one of the underground Golden Prison's passages. It was none other than the head of the 4th Office, 6 Office's Commander Im Gyuil. Spotting 6 Office's Commander So Yaren through the smoke entrance, Im Gyuil's face brightened. Heavens have helped. As expected, 6 Office's Commander So Yaren undoubtedly had a deep connection with him. He didn't know what that smoke door was, but just seeing her there made it certain that it led outside. At this, Im Gyuil rushed towards them using lightness skill and shouted, "Pot! 6 Office's Commander So, help me." However, behind him, men with expressionless faces, their entire bodies glinting with a copper hue, were also using lightness skill to chase after him. Clang, clang, clang. Each time they leaped, a metallic sound rang out, indicating they weren't ordinary humans. Seeing this, 6 Office's Commander So Yaren frowned and said, "Bronze men." Those were undoubtedly bronze men. They were beings born through unorthodox arts, possessing human forms but lacking consciousness or will, moving only according to set commands. Looking at those bronze men and 6 Office's Commander Im Gyuil leading them, Mok Jung-un clicked his tongue. Dragging along useless things. Swish. Mok Jung-un passed through the smoke entrance and made a pulling gesture with his hand. Then Holy Fire Priestess's body, who had been painstakingly walking with her aged frame, floated up and flew towards Mok Jung-un. Oh my! As Holy Fire Priestess also passed through the entrance. Swish. Mok Jung-un stopped infusing curse power into the talisman held between his index and middle fingers. With the curse power cut off, he expected the smoke door to close immediately, but contrary to this expectation, the smoke door slowly dissipated and had yet to disappear. It maintained a state of being on the verge of closing. Clang, clang, clang. In the meantime, 6 Office's Commander Im Gyuil, along with the bronze men of the Eternal Hell Prison chasing him, reached the immediate vicinity of the entrance. At this rate, even they would come out through the door. Mok Jung-un grasped his sword, intending to prevent them from crossing over, but right then, "I'll do it." With those words, someone powerfully stepped on an acupoint towards the smoke entrance. Thud. That someone was none other than 6 Office's Commander So Yaren. Seeing this, 6 Office's Commander Im Gyuil, who had been rushing towards the smoke entrance, was startled and shouted in shock. "Officer So! Why, what are you doing?" Before he could even finish his words, So Yaren forcefully pulled back her sword and thrust it towards the entrance. True chasing and turning sword. At that instant, sword energy swirled from the tip of her blade and surged towards the entrance with a momentum akin to a storm. The sword technique with a tempestuous force blocked the entrance, and 6 Office's Commander Im Gyuil, along with the bronze men of the eternal hell prison who had been rushing over, were swept up by it and bounced away. Chapter 282, Entanglements 2. The true chasing and turning sword of Six Offices Commander So Yaren surged with a momentum akin to a storm as it swirled. Its power was so strong that Six Offices Commander Mguil and the bronze men were all swept up by the sword energy and bounced away. The face of Mguil, who had been rejoicing just a moment ago that he was alive, was truly miserable. As they were swept away by the sword energy, a coincidental event occurred. The smoke door that had remained open now closed completely. As the door fully vanished, the talisman held between the index and middle fingers shattered and dispersed. It clearly proved to be a single-use item. Staring intently at the shattered talisman, Mok Jang-un slowly turned his head and spoke to Six Offices Commander So Yaren. Wasn't he your colleague? If she was the head of the Sixth Office, Mguil was the head of the Fourth Office. Although they were from different offices, they could be considered colleagues of the same rank in the embroidered uniform guard, so he hadn't expected her to suddenly unleash a sword stance at him. To Mok Jang-un's question she replied, "Better than things getting complicated." Six Offices Commander So Yaren also had an eye for the situation. With two escaped prisoners clearly present, if he, the head in charge of the underground Golden Prison, were to escape, it was evident that things would get complicated. Therefore she unleashed the sword stance without a moment's hesitation. "Is it all right to say our interests aligned?" At Mok Jang-un's words, So Yaren silently turned her head and looked at Nine Blood Sect's Sixth Blood Saint Dam Bekha. At this, Dam Bekha bowed to her with her hands clasped and said, "You are indeed the one who carries his bloodline, correct?" To this question So Yaren briefly glanced around and finally nodded. "That's right." At her answer, the masked thousand-men commander of the embroidered uniform guard, Ma Arahayan, who had been watching, exclaimed in astonishment. From the beginning, Ma Arahayan knew that his master So Yaren had joined the embroidered uniform guard here to find someone. However, he didn't know that person was a prisoner locked in the underground Golden Prison. Suddenly Ma Arahayan looked at Mok Jang-un with surprised eyes. Then were they indeed connected? If one of the two people Mok Jang-un had broken out was the person Six Offices Commander So Yaren had been searching for, it would be strange to say they had no connection. Meanwhile, Dam Bekha knelt on one knee with reddened eyes and said, "Thud. I've been searching for so long. Blood Demon. Please don't do this." So Yaren tried to make her stand up. However, Dam Bekha shook her head and refused. "No. Young miss, you are the only remaining true heir who can carry on the lineage of our sect. How can this subordinate not pay her respects? The true heir to carry on the sect?" At her words, Mok Jang-un looked at them with bewilderment. What was the relationship between these two? Nine Blood Sect's blood demon Dam Bekha had been searching for someone related to that person, who carried the blood of Jin clan and So clan. In the midst of this, Mok Jang-un had intended to have the masked thousand-men commander Ma Arahayan meet Dam Bekha, thinking he might know something, but he suddenly realized that Six Offices Commander So Yaren was the So clan Dam Bekha had been searching for. However, for blood demon Dam Bekha, who was called a remnant of the Nine Blood Sect, to suddenly call So Yaren the true heir to carry on the sect. Are Jin clan and So clan the family of the leaders from the destroyed Nine Blood Sect? It had to be that way for things to make some sense. While sorting this out in his mind, So Yaren also knelt on one knee, met Dam Bekha's gaze and said, "I don't have the qualifications for that." "What do you mean you don't have the qualifications?" "He was also the sect leader of our Nine Blood Sect. If you, who inherited his bloodline, don't have the qualifications, then who does?" At Dam Bekha's words, Six Offices Commander So Yaren tightly shut her mouth. She had an expression as if she was in a difficult position. To her, Dam Bekha even prostrated herself and said, "Bam. This is all the guidance of the heavens. Please take in this subordinate and the surviving sect members and revive our Nine Blood Sect." Blood Demon. At her attitude, So Yaren couldn't help but feel even more embarrassed. Seeing the executive of the Nine Blood Sect go this far, it seemed certain that So Yaren was indeed connected to the Nine Blood Sect, which was known to have been destroyed. However, now was not the time to continue this conversation. With the underground Golden Prison collapsing, earthquakes must have occurred, and the situation must have escalated, causing chaos throughout the imperial palace. Taking advantage of this opportunity, they had to quickly escape the imperial palace. At this, Mok Jae-young interjected and politely said, "I don't know what kind of relationship you two have, but it seems you've had a moving reunion, so congratulations. However, if we spend more time here, it will become difficult to leave the imperial palace." Leave the imperial palace? At these words, So Yeren turned her head and alternately looked at Mok Jae-young and the old woman Holy Fire Priestess. Then she asked the prostrating blood demon Dam Baekha, "Is this person also from the blood sect?" "No. That young old woman is the one I truly came to save." "You came to save that elder?" Due to Dam Baekha's words, So Yeren had been doubtful until just now, but she realized that Mok Jae-young had nothing to do with them. It seemed he had met blood demon Dam Baekha by pure coincidence in the underground golden prison and came out together. Meanwhile, Mok Jae-young spoke to the masked thousand-men commander Ma Are-hyen. "Commander Ma Are-hyen, did you prepare that?" At Mok Jae-young's question, Ma Are-hyen instinctively replied, "Yes. It's prepared outside the warehouse." Seeing him respectfully answer as if he were a subordinate, So Yeren intervened in a tone of incomprehension. "Commander Ma Are-hyen, since when have you been helping him?" He was a disciple to whom she had imparted martial arts and was like her right-hand man. Seeing him behave as if he were loyal to Mok Jae-young was utterly unacceptable. The Ma Are-hyen she knew would never submit to anyone. "Did Mok Jae-young know your weakness?" "Officer So. That's..." Ma Are-hyen was flustered and at a loss for words. Due to the evil energy he had naturally developed loyalty to Mok Jae-young, but 6 Office's Commander So Yeren was his master, mentor and superior. She was such a special existence to him that it was difficult to endure her interrogation. Then Mok Jae-young intervened. "Don't press him too hard. I merely helped Commander Ma Are-hyen, who was addicted to poison goo and caught by a weakness, that's all." "What? Poison goo? What do you mean by that?" she asked in surprise, looking at Mok Jae-young. To this, Mok Jae-young shrugged and replied, "Exactly what I said. The Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ik-seo had addicted Commander Ma Are-hyen here to poison goo and had been continuously blackmailing him. Isn't that right?" "That's correct." Ma Are-hyen answered with difficulty. There was no falsehood in what was said regarding this matter. At this, So Yeren spoke in dismay. "Commander Ma Are-hyen, why didn't you tell me?" "It's not that I couldn't tell you. They said that if you get addicted to poison goo, you'll be bound by a prohibition and just mentioning it would cost you your life. I can't believe you didn't know until now. You weren't attentive enough to your subordinate." At Mok Jae-young's sarcastic words, So Yeren bit her lip hard. She was inwardly angry but couldn't say anything. She had a firm belief that she must protect her people no matter what. However, she couldn't help but feel a sense of self-reproach upon realizing that she had been unaware until now that her right-hand man had been addicted to poison goo. So Yeren looked at Ma Are-hyen and spoke with difficulty. "Commander Ma Are-hyen, Officer So. It's all right. It was truly an unavoidable situation. I wanted to tell you but I didn't want to trouble you." "How could that be troublesome? I didn't even know you were in such a painful situation." Seeing her eyes redden, Ma Are-hyen hurriedly waved his hands. His heart ached at the sight of her blaming herself. Absolutely none of this is your fault, Officer So. All of this happened due to my carelessness." At his words, So Yeren stared intently, swallowed dryly and said, "Are you all right now?" At this question, Ma Are-hyen hesitated for a moment but then answered without delay. "I'm fine. If it weren't for young Master Mok's help I would have died." In fact, the parasitic male poison goo was still in his body. And the one controlling that poison goo had merely changed from Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ik-seo to Mok Jae-young. There was also a prohibition against speaking about this, but Ma Are-hyen, not wanting to worry his mentor So Yeren, lied. It was better to do this than to hold her back. "Is that true?" "Yes, and thanks to young Master Mok, I also secured evidence of the assassination plan that Associate Military Commissioner Sang Ik-seo was about to carry out. It's in that place in the office." At Ma Are-hyen's words, So Yeren silently turned her head and looked at Mok Jae-young. If what Ma Are-hyen said was true, she should be grateful instead. She glanced at blood demon Dam Baekha as well. Whether intentional or not, thanks to him she was able to confirm the survival and even save the blood demon she had been trying to rescue. Furthermore, even the disciple Zhu Wenxiang who was connected to her had almost been trapped in the underground golden prison and unable to escape, but Mok Jiangun had saved him. Considering all this, she was entirely indebted to him. At this, 6 Office's commander So Yeren clasped her hands together and bowed to Mok Jiangun. Young Miss. Officer So? Ignoring the puzzled questions of Ma Arihayan and Dam Bekha, So Yeren spoke in a respectful voice. Young Master Mok, I express my gratitude to you. At her attitude, a gleam flashed in Mok Jiangun's eyes. He had been worried that things might become more troublesome, but he hadn't expected her to express gratitude to him. She seemed to have quite a strong sense of pride, but surprisingly she was quick to acknowledge. Well, it's not like I did anything particularly deserving of gratitude. They were merely byproducts that occurred in the process of resolving his own matters. However, there was no reason to refuse when she was expressing gratitude. Mok Jiangun also clasped his hands and bowed to her, replying as a formality, "It wasn't something I did intentionally. Even so, it doesn't change the fact that I owe you in many ways, young Master Mok. Therefore I will make sure to repay this debt." At her words, Mok Jiangun chuckled inwardly. She said she would definitely repay the debt, but she was speaking with a determined voice as if she were going to take revenge on an enemy. It seemed she couldn't internally accept being indebted to him. However, thanks to this, a good card had appeared. Now that he had safely gotten Holy Fire Priestess out of the underground golden prison, the remaining concern was leaving the Imperial Palace. It seemed he could also receive her help in this matter. Mok Jiangun smiled and said to her, "Since you say you will definitely repay the debt, I have a suggestion. How about helping us leave the Imperial Palace?" At this, Blood Demon Dam Bekha also interjected as if it were a good opportunity. "Young Mississippi, why don't we also leave the Imperial Palace with them this time? For the sake of rebuilding our sect." Blood Demon. "I'm sorry. Pardon. As I said before, I don't have the qualifications you speak of." "Young Miss, why do you keep saying that?" "I apologize. And I still have things to do in the Imperial Palace." "What?" Surprised by the unexpected refusal, Blood Demon Dam Bekha frowned. She had thought So Yeren would certainly go with them, but she hadn't expected her to suddenly refuse. No, even if not rebuilding the blood sect, she had at least expected her to leave this place together. "Why do you want to stay in a place like this?" "That's..." So Yeren hesitated and glanced at the unconscious Zhu Wenxiang. They had made a promise to each other. "So what do you want?" "I will overturn this rotten nation from within." Zhu Wenxiang. "Do you know what you're trying to say now?" "That's..." "Yes, this is treason." Chapter 283, Entanglements 3. Zhu Wenxiang. "Do you know what you're trying to say now?" "That's..." "Yes, it's treason." Treason. She had never expected those words to come out of his mouth. She still couldn't forget the determined look in that man's eyes. She had met countless people until now, but he was the first to reveal such an absurd ambition. Overturn the nation? His martial arts were weak and he had no power at all. He had nothing to his name, yet how could such words come out of his mouth? Nevertheless, she didn't ridicule this ambition. This nation was rotten to the core. The emperor was immersed in lust, and the powerful officials were only focused on fighting for power. The people were suffering, but those in power and the privileged class were still busy exploiting them, and the people's livelihood was becoming increasingly destitute. The people who should have been cultivating the land were starving to death or becoming bandits, harming each other. This would only get worse, not better. That's why So Yeren understood why Zhu Wenxiang revealed such an ambition. However, she couldn't judge whether he could achieve it or not. No matter how rotten and festering, it was a nation. Bringing down a nation was not something that could be done with the strength or ambition of a single individual. But she wanted to watch. She wanted to see if that man could achieve that ambition when people like herself and others lent their strength one by one. "Young Miss." At that moment, 9 blood sects Blood Demon Dam Bekha called out to her. Yes." At this, So Yeren, who had been lost in thought, came to her senses. She turned her gaze to Dam Bekha. Her promise with Zhu Wenxiang was not something she could mention to anyone, so she spoke of another reason why she had to stay in the Imperial Palace. I'm searching for clues about the great calamity. At those words, blood demon Dam Bekha frowned and spoke. When you say the great calamity, could it be? Yes, that day. I'm searching for clues about the day that created the boundary between the current martial world and the old martial world. Young miss, that incident is already. Yes, it's an old story now. But my father lost his life in the process of searching for clues about it. When you say your father? His courtesy name uses the characters Jin, Yang, and In. At So Yaren's words, Dam Bekha spoke in surprise. That person is the So clan leader, isn't he? At her words, So Yaren replied in a bitter voice. That's right. I heard he was. The peerless So clan leader was alive. Dam Bekha nodded, finally realizing the position of So Yaren's family. However, on the other hand, she looked intently at So Yaren's face as if she couldn't understand. That's because if she was the daughter of Jin Yongin, the So clan leader, she should be of considerable age now. But no matter how one looked at it, she appeared to be only in her 20s. It could be that she had achieved longevity, but there was no sense of spiritual energy that would suggest that. At this bewilderment, So Yaren spoke as if reading her thoughts. At that time, all the people of Jin clan lost their lives in the Great Calamity. I was born from my father's connection with my mother while he was searching for clues about the Great Calamity. I see. Dam Bekha sighed in understanding. So Yaren was the daughter of the So clan leader and carried his bloodline, but she was not someone who had experienced that era. No, in the first place, the only one who knew about that era was probably herself, who would still be alive now. Of course, what was really important wasn't that. But young miss, you said the So clan leader lost his life while searching for clues about the Great Calamity. What do you mean by that? She asked in a trembling voice. At this, So Yaren replied with reddened eyes, clenching her fists tightly. My father was murdered here in Kaifeng. How could such a thing happen? Jin Yongin, the So clan leader, was one of the greatest masters of the era who surpassed the pinnacle. But how could he? My father lost one leg and his left eye on the day of the Great Calamity. He said his martial arts were not as they used to be. Even so, he wouldn't have been someone who could be easily defeated. For someone to be able to harm him, could it be that he approached the clues about the day of the Great Calamity? It seems so. So Yaren still couldn't forget that night. Her father, Jin Yongin, who had suffered severe injuries, barely escaped the imperial capital Kaifeng while holding her. And even on the verge of death, he transferred all his innate true energy to her. On his deathbed, her father held her hand tightly and entrusted her. No more. Don't get involved in this matter anymore. Rena, please, your life. Those were his last words. He didn't want his daughter to avenge him or search for clues about the Great Calamity. However, she couldn't do that. She had lost her only blood relative. Drip. A tear rolled down So Yaren's cheek. Seeing this, Dam Bekha silently embraced her. The feeling of losing a loved one was something she had experienced countless times throughout her long life. Nevertheless, far from getting used to it each time it happened, her heart felt like it was being torn apart. Understanding this, she silently embraced her to comfort her. Mok Jiongun, who had been staring intently at her, let out a small sigh. Although he was clumsy with other emotions, he knew well the feeling of losing a loved one, so he just watched, but time was running out. They couldn't stay here any longer. The day of the Great Calamity or the old martial world, whatever it was their matter anyway. Meanwhile, So Yaren, who had been sobbing in Dam Bekha's arms, wiped her tears with her sleeve and spoke. Thank you. Please don't mention it. By the way, there was something I wanted to ask the blood demon. You mean me? I heard that you were the only one who experienced the day of the Great Calamity. Is that right? That's correct. At that question, Dam Bekha sighed and nodded. Everyone else had passed away, so that was the case. At this, So Yaren asked, I heard that on the day of the Great Calamity, you faced a four-headed demonic creature that turned 5 cities into ruins. Is that true? Yes. That's right. Perhaps recalling the memory of that day, Dam Bekha's expression rapidly darkened. For her, that day was no different from hell. It was the day she lost countless loved ones and the day she received the curse of longevity, Chongqing, which she would discard if she could. So Yaren took a deep breath and spoke to her, whose energy had diminished. I heard that at that time, an absolute master appeared and barely killed the demonic creature, stealing its essence. Is that correct? At her question, Dame Becca's eyes wavered. Her eyes were already picturing that day which had become the distant past. She, along with the executives of the Blood Sect, thousands of sect members and martial artists of the Evil Faction Alliance, had gathered to fight day and night to kill the demonic creature. However, even though all those martial artists fought with their lives on the line, killing the demonic creature was far from easy. They had to cut off all its heads at roughly the same time to kill it, but they didn't know this properly, so after cutting off a head, it would regenerate not long after, and the battle continued endlessly. 3 venerables. 3 ancestors. B-blood demon. 4th blood demon has fallen in battle. Huff huff. There's no more hope. That monster won't die. By the time they discovered the demonic creature's weakness, nearly 70% of their forces had already lost their lives. However, with so many people dying, they finally learned that they could kill the demonic creature by cutting off all its heads, so they engaged in one last fierce battle. It was around the time they had cut off 2 of the demonic creature's heads. There was no way that the remaining 30% of their forces could withstand the demonic creature that they had barely dealt with even when all their forces were intact. Almost everyone had lost their lives and only a few remained alive. It was at that moment. Someone appeared. It was a supreme swordsmanship I had never seen before in my life. Swordsmanship. Yes. Each sword move exceeded the range of motion of the joints and even surpassed the limits of the muscles. It was a monstrous swordsmanship used by that person. At these words, So Yeren frowned. Regardless, Blood Demon Dame Becca continued. That person who suddenly appeared cut off the remaining 2 necks of the demonic creature that we had been struggling so much with. At his appearance, the survivors cheered. They thought a supreme expert had come to their aid. However, when the demonic creature died like that, the supreme expert smashed the demonic creature's back shell and extracted the essence inside. Up to that point there was no problem. We didn't even know what the essence of a spiritual creature was in the first place, and our goal was simply to kill the demonic creature. But what followed was the issue. The person who had extracted the demonic creature's essence suddenly attacked the surviving martial artists. With his abrupt actions, Dame Becca realized that this person was not their ally. I tried to fight him along with the remaining sect members. However, she couldn't do that. When cutting off the demonic creature's neck, she had swallowed some of its blood, which caused her internal organs to be overturned by lightning power, and she was engulfed in unimaginable pain. Unable to endure that pain, she had to watch her sect members die as she lost consciousness. If the elder hadn't come, I would have lost my life as well. Elder? It's that person. I also heard from my father that he had gone to help. Yes. If the elder hadn't arrived in time, I would also be in the netherworld. At her words, So Yeren asked in a hopeful voice, could the elder still be alive? I apologize, but I don't know. The last time I saw him was before I was imprisoned in the underground golden prison of the Imperial Palace here. It's been decades. Until then, the elder was also in good health. He was wandering near the Jangang River, carrying a bamboo fishing rod on his shoulder. Bamboo fishing rod? Mok Jiongun, who had been silently listening to their conversation, had a gleam in his eyes. At the mention of an elder carrying a bamboo fishing rod, someone came to mind. It was the elderly man with a pale face and a scholarly appearance that he had seen on the boat in the pouring rain. Is it a coincidence? Just mentioning that he had a bamboo fishing rod, the appearance and attire overlapped. Even though it was just one thing. However, Blood Demon Dame Becca said she had seen that elder decades ago. If she, who had achieved immortality, called him an elder, he must be an extremely old man. There was no way such a person could still be alive. Or could it be possible? Come to think of it, there was a woman right in front of him who had achieved immortality in a youthful appearance. So there was no reason why there couldn't be an old man who had lived a long time. At this, Mok Jiongun abruptly asked them, sorry to interrupt, but does that elder have a pale face, sharp eyes and a scholarly appearance? As soon as he finished speaking, So Yeren and Dame Becca simultaneously turned their heads. Then the 2 of them approached him at the same time and said, what did you just say? Did you say a scholarly appearance? Asked simultaneously, Mok Jiongun scratched his head and said, before coming to Kaifeng I had to cross a river and there I met an old man holding a bamboo fishing rod. At Mok Jiongun's words, Dame Becca looked at him with doubtful eyes. Then she carefully spoke to So Yeren beside her. Young Mississippi. might not be him. Although the appearance and attire seem similar, considering the elder's age, no matter how profound his internal energy is. Swish. Before she could even finish her words, Mok Jae-eun grasped his sword and assumed a stance. Seeing this, So Yeren and Blood Demon Dam Bakha, who had been skeptical, momentarily looked at him with surprised eyes. Then Mok Jae-eun unfolded a sword technique. Swish 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 swish. A refreshing sword path reminiscent of a full moon. So Yeren's eyes trembled as she watched this. Having inherited all the martial arts related to her family from her father, she recognized at a glance what sword technique Mok Jae-eun was using. Moonless Void Sword. Chapter 284, Entanglements 4. It was when 6 Offices Commander So Yeren and 9 Blood Sects Blood Demon Dam Bakha were having a long conversation. The masked embroidered uniform guard Ma Are-hyen, who had been worried that helping Mok Jae-eun's kidnapping of the underground Golden Prison's prisoners might lead to trouble, was relieved and quietly observing. As he stood there silently, Ma Are-hyen's gaze had at some point shifted from So Yeren and Dam Bakha to someone else. It was an old woman wearing a prisoner's uniform, Holy Fire Priestess. His initial interest in Holy Fire Priestess was due to her old age. How was someone so elderly imprisoned in the Eternal Hell Prison? He had heard that the Eternal Hell Prison was where only the worst felons were held. Those imprisoned there were said to be mostly traitors or those who had reached an uncontrollable level, but that old woman seemed strange. That's because there were no signs of her having cultivated internal energy. Even if she had concealed her martial arts, her footsteps were no different from ordinary people. What crime did she commit? And why did Mok Jae-eun bring her out? As he was wondering, Ma Are-hyen, who had been intently staring at the Holy Fire Priestess's face, frowned. At first it was just curiosity about who she was. But strangely her face seemed familiar. Strange. Had he ever encountered a prisoner from the Eternal Hell Prison in the underground Golden Prison? Like 6 Offices Commander So Yeren, he had never been assigned to the 4th office. But why did her face seem familiar? After staring for a while, Ma Are-hyen's eyes narrowed like needles. I definitely saw her. Although it was very old and faint, he had seen that old woman before. Ma Are-hyen's pupils contracted as he couldn't take his eyes off Holy Fire Priestess, trying to let it pass without much thought. Ma Are-hyen tried to remember her somehow. Instinctively he felt that he shouldn't just overlook it. Obsessed with the compulsion to remember at all costs, he couldn't even hear the conversation between So Yeren and Dam Bakha. Then, swish. As if sensing the gaze staring at her intensely, the Holy Fire Priestess unconsciously looked at Ma Are-hyen. As their eyes met, the Holy Fire Priestess wondered why he was doing that. She had been instinctively avoiding his gaze because he was wearing the embroidered uniform guard attire, but being stared at so intently made her uneasy. However, the Holy Fire Priestess's eyes also narrowed. She hadn't noticed before, but she discovered the azure eyes visible through the gaps in his mask. Seeing this, the Holy Fire Priestess couldn't hide her shock. She unknowingly twisted her body and muttered softly, "Priest Mayera?" However, as a skilled martial artist, there was no way Ma Are-hyen wouldn't hear this. Priest Mayera? The moment he heard this, Ma Are-hyen's eyes trembled violently. As he was concentrating with all his might to remember the familiar face, forgotten memories stirred and surfaced in his mind. It was Ma Are-hyen's childhood. Standing next to his mother, Ma Are-hyen was watching someone who was busy packing and preparing to leave. Unlike the mixed-blood Ma Are-hyen, he was a perfect Westerner with blonde hair and azure eyes. Dressed in Chinese attire rather than Western clothing, the Westerner approached his mother, hugged her, and patted Ma Are-hyen's head. "My son." With those words, the Westerner turned and headed towards the door. In front of the door stood a middle-aged woman with a graceful appearance, leaning on a cane with a blue jade bead embedded in it. The middle-aged woman was none other than the old woman. He now understood why her face seemed familiar, but he couldn't remember. It was because it was a long time ago, and her face had become so haggard and wrinkled that it didn't come to mind. The Westerner spoke to the old woman in a clumsy manner. "You've waited a long time. No, Priest Mayera. Let's go now." "Thank you. Having Priest Mayera from the main order in the homeland accompany us will be a great strength to the believers of our order." At her words, the Westerner showed a peculiar expression. That expression was utterly bitter. It was as if he was going to a place from which he could not return. And that bitter face was the last one Ma Arehayan saw of the Westerner. Father. The Westerner was none other than Ma Arehayan's father. Is foreboding always accurate? When leaving, his father had promised to return. But in the end he never came back. What returned were a few of his father's belongings, and upon receiving the news of his death along with those items, his mother was unable to overcome her grief and passed away after a prolonged illness. Clench. Now everything came back to him. His mother who had a bad feeling and begged his father to stay. His father who had been conflicted until the end. And that old woman who had persuaded his father to go with her. Squeeze. Ma Arehayan's nails dug into his clenched fists. Anger suddenly surged. If only that old woman hadn't appeared and taken his damned father, his mother wouldn't have died from grief, and he wouldn't have been dragged around by slave traders for years, labeled as a mixed blood. This bitch. Nevertheless, that old woman never showed up in front of them. She had babbled about personally coming to take his father because he was a priest of the main sect in the homeland, but in the end, the one who delivered the news of his death was a low-ranking believer they had never heard of. Unable to contain his anger, Ma Arehayan approached the Holy Fire Priestess. This guy. The Holy Fire Priestess took a step back for a moment. The moment she saw Ma Arehayan's azure eyes, she was reminded of someone. But that someone had died. A long time ago. So it meant it was someone she didn't know, but the moment she saw those burning eyes, she could instinctively tell it was anger. Step. As he approached silently, the Holy Fire Priestess's eyes wavered. At first she didn't understand where this anger came from. But the moment Ma Arehayan took 2 steps forward, someone flashed through her mind. It was. Could it be? The mixed-blood boy she had seen at Priest Meyer's house. A boy with black hair because he was a mix of Chinese and Western blood, but with an exotic appearance and azure eyes that resembled his father's. The Holy Fire Priestess was momentarily engulfed in shock. If that boy were alive, he would have grown up and become an adult by now. How could this be? Was he really alive? When she went back there, no one was there. Even if she wanted to ask someone, they lived deep in the mountains, so she couldn't even inquire about their whereabouts. At this, Holy Fire Priestess spoke to the approaching Ma Arehayan. Could you possibly be? Right then. Swish 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 swish. Mok Jiongun suddenly unleashed a sword technique. Although it was a technique she had never seen before, the grandeur contained in the sword path was so tremendous that everyone couldn't help but have their attention stolen by it for a moment. The sword technique, reminiscent of a full moon, had many sword intentions despite its uncomplicated trajectory. Ha! Even Ma Arehayan, who had been consumed by anger, couldn't take his eyes off it. As a martial artist, it was impossible to ignore the sword technique Mok Jiongun was demonstrating. How can such complexity be contained within simplicity? It wasn't just Ma Arehayan who had this thought. Even from the mouths of So Yaren and Blood Demon Dam Bekha, who knew what sword art Mok Jiongun was using, exclamations of admiration flowed out. As she watched the sword technique, So Yaren's eyes widened. The reason was that the moonless void sword Mok Jiongun was using was different from what she knew. Different. The trajectory of the sword moves was different. The unnecessary sword paths that existed in the original sword stances were gone, and each of the original sword paths was thoroughly focused on killing the opponent. However, the sword stances of the moonless void sword that Mok Jiongun demonstrated even broke away from the framework of the existing sword paths. Flow. Tears flowed down So Yaren's cheeks as she watched this. It was a sword path that made even her heart swell. Even though the sword path moved freely, breaking away from the framework of the original stances, it didn't deviate from the framework of the moonless void sword. Was it real? Blood Demon Dam Bekha even opened her mouth and stuck out her tongue. The sword technique Mok Jiongun was demonstrating now was close to perfection. If the sword she had seen from the Elder in the past was filled only with killing intent, the current sword was the embodiment of freedom itself. Undoubtedly, it's the Elder's sword. Even if the form was different, the sword intent couldn't change. However, what was astonishing was the moonless void sword, which was known as one of the 5 great sword arts of the Central Plains even back then. To think that such a sword art could evolve to this extent. Indeed, the Elder was an unparalleled genius. Plop. At that moment, someone was seen sitting on the ground. It was none other than the masked embroidered uniform guard Ma Arehayan. Ma Arehayan, who had been staring intently at Mok Jaeongun's sword, closed his eyes as if he had gained some enlightenment and entered a state of meditation. Ha! Look at this guy. He was a very lucky fellow. The sword Mok Jaeongun was demonstrating now was close to the pinnacle of swordsmanship, surpassing the state of transcendence. If one couldn't gain any enlightenment after seeing that, it could only be said that they lacked talent. Dame Bekha glanced at So Yeren. Judging by her flushed face and inability to take her eyes off the sword technique, it seemed she had also gained enlightenment. As expected of his descendant, Dame Bekha had briefly clashed with So Yeren. Her martial prowess was not inferior even when compared to herself, who had cultivated martial arts for a long time. No, it was difficult to fathom its end. Yet despite that she gained further enlightenment here. She was indeed a person of great talent. Blood couldn't be deceived. Swish. Meanwhile, Mok Jaeongun stopped demonstrating the sword technique. It was to prove that he had met the old man, so there was no need to display the entire stance. As Mok Jaeongun stopped midway, So Yeren's eyes were filled with regret. Ah. That's because it was a moment when she was about to grasp something. It wasn't a small enlightenment but a huge starting point that could lead to a higher realm. However, as Mok Jaeongun stopped the sword technique, the starting point she was about to touch and enter a state of contemplation also ceased. As a result, she couldn't help but smack her lips in disappointment. To her, Mok Jaeongun said, "As you can see, I received teachings from the elder. But I don't know if it's the same elder that Officer So knows." "Wait, did you say you received teachings just now?" "Yes." "Directly from him, young Master Mok?" "Well, yes. Thanks to that, he was able to create the demonic sword art on his own." However, at Mok Jaeongun's answer, So Yeren and Dame Bekha looked at each other with surprised eyes. Then, bam! Blood demon Dame Bekha knelt on one knee in front of Mok Jaeongun, suddenly clasped her hands together and paid her respects.